Hello guys, welcome to Infinite Stories. Please leave a like and subscribe to our channel for more interesting stories. Let's get into the story. Elena Richards had once believed in fairy tales. She had imagined a life filled with love, laughter, and a husband who cherished her above all else. But reality had dealt her a cruel hand. Now, as she sat alone in the grand but empty dining room of their luxurious home, she stared at the cold, untouched dinner she had prepared for her husband, Timothy Richard. The house, despite its opulence, felt hollow, like a beautifully decorated cage. She had everything money could buy, yet she had nothing that truly mattered. Her marriage had become a loveless prison, and she was its silent prisoner. She was pregnant, carrying their child, but instead of feeling cherished, she felt invisible. Timothy had once held her close, whispering promises of forever, but those days were long gone. Now, his presence was rare, and when he was home, his words were sharp daggers, meant to wound rather than soothe. She had hoped that their baby would rekindle their lost love, but instead, it seemed to push him further away. Timothy had changed drastically since the early days of their marriage. At first, he had been the perfect husband, attentive, loving, and devoted. But somewhere along the way, he had grown cold, distant, and cruel. It wasn't just neglect, it was the sheer lack of regard for her feelings. He would come home late, reeking of expensive cologne that wasn't his usual scent, his shirt slightly wrinkled, his tie undone in a careless way that spoke of intimacy with another woman. Elena wasn't naive. She knew what was happening. The whispers behind her back, the lingering glances of pity from their household staff, and the empty space beside her in bed all pointed to one undeniable truth: her husband was cheating on her. But what hurt even more than the betrayal was his complete lack of remorse. He didn't even try to hide it anymore. He treated her as if she were an inconvenience, a burden he couldn't wait to rid himself of. The pain of unreciprocated love was suffocating. Elena had sacrificed everything for this marriage. She had abandoned her successful career, distanced herself from her friends, and devoted herself entirely to being the perfect wife. And now, she was carrying their child, a piece of both of them, but instead of being excited, Timothy acted as though the baby didn't exist. His indifference was crueler than any harsh words he could have spoken. That night, as she sat waiting for him, she felt a tear slip down her cheek. Was this really her life? Was this what she had signed up for? A marriage where she had to beg for attention, beg for love, beg for even the smallest acknowledgement? The loneliness was unbearable, pressing down on her chest like a weight she could never lift. As the grand clock in the hallway struck midnight, Elena finally accepted the truth: Timothy wasn't coming home. Not to her, at least. The dinner, now cold, remained untouched, just like her heart. Slowly, she rose from the table, clutching her belly protectively. This baby was the only thing keeping her going. She had spent so long waiting for Timothy to change, but maybe it was time she stopped waiting. Maybe it was time she started thinking about herself and her child. Because if there was one thing she knew for certain, it was that Timothy Richard no longer loved her, and maybe, just maybe, he never truly had. Elena had always trusted Timothy. She believed in the vows they had exchanged and never doubted his love for her. Even when he started coming home late, brushing off her questions with vague excuses about work, she assumed it was just the stress of his career. He had always been ambitious, always striving for more. But lately, something felt different. He no longer held her the way he used to, no longer kissed her forehead before leaving in the morning. At night, he rolled over with his back to her, as if her presence no longer mattered. Still, she refused to think the worst. She was his wife, carrying his child. Surely, if something was wrong, he would tell her. But Timothy was keeping secrets. Deep, painful secrets. And Elena had no idea. While she spent her evenings alone, waiting for him to come home, Timothy was out in the city with another woman. Benita Collins was young, stunning, and dangerously ambitious. Unlike Elena, who carried the weight of a growing child and the responsibilities of a home, Benita was free. She laughed loudly, dressed in tight-fitting designer clothes, and made Timothy feel like a man in control. With her, he wasn't a husband or a father-to-be, he was just a man indulging in pleasure. He spent money on her like it was nothing, buying her expensive jewelry, luxury handbags, and weekend getaways, all while his pregnant wife sat at home, unaware. One evening, as Elena carefully prepared dinner, excited for Timothy's return, he sent a brief text, "Working late. Don't wait up." Her heart sank. It wasn't the first time. She sighed, brushing off the sadness creeping into her chest. Maybe he was really working late. She had no idea that, at that very moment, Timothy was in a lavish restaurant across town, feeding Benita from his own plate, his laughter echoing through the candlelit space. He had ordered the most expensive wine on the menu, toasting to freedom and real love. And when the dinner ended, he took her hand, leading her into the night like a man unburdened by responsibility. Back at home, Elena sat alone at the dining table, staring at the untouched plates of food. She ran her fingers over her swollen belly, whispering softly, "He'll come around. He's just stressed." She had no reason to suspect otherwise. In her mind, Timothy was still her husband, still the man who once held her like she was the most precious thing in the world. But that man was long gone, lost in the arms of another woman. And Elena? She was living in a lie, completely unaware that her husband had already abandoned her. Elena lived in quiet agony, trapped in a marriage that no longer offered love, comfort, or even basic kindness. She woke up every morning hoping that something would change, that Timothy would look at her the way he once did, but his eyes were always cold. His words, when he spoke to her at all, were short and distant. Every conversation felt like a chore for him. And still, she held on. She told herself it was just a rough patch, that once the baby was born, things would be different. But deep inside, she was suffocating. Each night, she lay beside him, listening to his steady breathing, feeling the vast emptiness between them. Even as she carried his child, he made her feel completely alone. Timothy's absence was both physical and emotional. He no longer cared for the small things, the cravings she had, the discomfort of her pregnancy, or the sleepless nights she endured. He spent more time on his phone than he did speaking to her, always texting someone late into the night. Elena tried to ignore the nagging doubt creeping into her mind, but it became harder when she caught glimpses of feminine names flashing across his screen. When she asked him about it, he scoffed, dismissing her concerns as paranoia. "You're pregnant, Elena. You're imagining things," he said, his voice laced with irritation. She wanted to believe him, but the pieces weren't adding up. Still, she suffered in silence. She never told her family or friends how he treated her, fearing their judgment. Her parents had warned her about rushing into marriage, and her friends had noticed Timothy's coldness long before she did. She didn't want to hear "I told you so." So she pretended. She smiled when people asked about her marriage. She spoke about Timothy as if he were still the loving husband she had once known. It was easier to fake happiness than to admit her world was crumbling. But in the privacy of their home, she wept in the shower, clutching her belly, whispering apologies to the child inside her. "I'll make it better," she promised. "I won't let you grow up in a broken home." But deep inside, she already knew the truth: her home was already broken. No matter how much she tried to mend it, Timothy had checked out. The love they once shared was gone, replaced by emptiness and quiet suffering. And as she lay in bed that night, listening to the faint sound of her husband sneaking out of the house, she finally allowed herself to wonder, was she truly imagining things, or was she slowly waking up to a painful reality? The changes in Timothy's behavior became impossible for Elena to ignore. At first, it was subtle. He would come home late, claiming that work kept him busy. But soon, it became a routine. He no longer ate dinner at home, no longer asked about her pregnancy, and no longer pretended to care. The scent of expensive perfume clung to his clothes, an unfamiliar floral fragrance that wasn't hers. She found receipts in his pockets for lavish restaurants and jewelry stores, yet she never received any gifts. The truth hovered in the air like a dark cloud, waiting to pour down on her, but she kept convincing herself that she was imagining things. She wanted to believe that her husband was just stressed, that he would return to her and their unborn child once things settled down. But deep down, she knew better. Rumors began to reach her ears, whispered in hushed voices by neighbors and acquaintances who couldn't ignore what was happening. "I saw your husband at the Grand Lux restaurant last night," a woman murmured during a grocery run. "He was with a woman. They looked close." Elena's stomach twisted, but she forced a smile. "You must be mistaken," she said, though she could feel the weight of those words pressing against her heart. More whispers followed. Timothy was seen at a high-end boutique with the same woman. He had been spotted driving around in his car with her, laughing, holding hands, acting like a man in love. But not with his wife. The evidence stacked up like a house of cards, and Elena felt like the wind was about to blow everything apart. One evening, determined to confront her fears, she decided to wait for him. She prepared his favorite meal, hoping that maybe, just maybe, he would sit down with her and explain everything. But midnight struck, and he still wasn't home. She called his phone, but it went straight to voicemail. Hours passed. When the clock neared 2 a.m., the sound of a car pulling into the driveway made her rush to the door. Timothy stepped out, adjusting his wrinkled shirt, his hair slightly disheveled. His wedding ring was missing. Elena's breath caught in her throat. "Where have you been?" she asked, her voice trembling. Timothy glanced at her with irritation, barely sparing her a second glance. "Out," he muttered. "I don't have to report to you." And with that, he walked past her, leaving her standing in the doorway, her heart breaking into 1,000 pieces. The confrontation she had imagined never came. He didn't even care enough to lie. That night, as she lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, Elena felt something inside her crack. She had spent so many nights convincing herself that she was overthinking, that Timothy still loved her. But now, there was no denying it. The man she had married was gone. And she was carrying the child of a man who no longer wanted her. The first time Timothy raised his hand against Elena, it wasn't out of anger, it was out of indifference. She had confronted him about his late nights and the rumors, her voice shaking as she begged him to tell her the truth. But Timothy, standing there in the middle of their bedroom, simply rolled his eyes and muttered something under his breath. When Elena pressed him, when she dared to ask if there was someone else, he turned to her with an expression so cold it sent a shiver down her spine. "You're pathetic," he spat. "Always whining, always complaining. Maybe if you weren't so useless, I wouldn't need someone else." Elena felt the words like a slap across her face, but what followed was worse. His hand moved fast, striking her across the cheek, sending her stumbling backward onto the bed. She gasped, holding her face as pain radiated through her skull. He didn't even look sorry. In fact, he seemed annoyed that she was still standing there, tears filling her eyes. From that moment on, the abuse only got worse. Timothy's words became sharper, his hands crueler. Every little thing set him off, the way she spoke, the way she walked, even the way she breathed. If dinner wasn't exactly the way he liked it, he would shove the plate aside, making her clean up the mess. If she asked him where he had been, he would grab her wrist and squeeze until she cried out in pain. He found power in her suffering, and Elena, trapped in a marriage that once held love, found herself sinking deeper into despair. He didn't just hurt her physically, he shattered her emotionally, tearing apart her confidence, her self-worth, until she felt like a ghost in her own home. And the worst part? He never once apologized. He would go to bed as if nothing had happened, leaving Elena to cry herself to sleep, wondering what she had done to deserve this. One night, after Timothy had spent the entire evening ignoring her, Elena tried once more to reach him. She stood in the doorway of their bedroom, her hands resting on her growing belly, her voice barely above a whisper. "Timothy, please. This isn't you. What happened to the man I married?" He let out a dry laugh, turning to her with an amused smirk. "That man is dead," he said, his voice void of any warmth. "You killed him the moment you trapped me with that baby." The words hit Elena harder than any slap ever could. Trapped him? Had their love meant nothing? Had their child, his own flesh and blood, become nothing more than a burden to him? She took a step back, shaking her head in disbelief, but before she could say another word, he grabbed her by the arm and shoved her against the wall. "Don't look at me like that," he growled. "You should be grateful I even let you stay here." Elena bit her lip, swallowing the sob threatening to escape. This wasn't love. This wasn't marriage. She had convinced herself that things would get better, that Timothy was just going through a phase. But standing there, bruises forming on her skin, she realized the truth. The man she loved was gone. And if she stayed, if she continued to endure this, she would lose herself completely. For the first time, she wondered if leaving was her only way to survive. Elena lay in bed that night, her body aching from Timothy's latest outburst, but her heart hurt even more. For months, she had convinced herself that he would change, that the man she once loved would return. She told herself that his cruelty was temporary, that once the baby arrived, he would remember what they once had. But reality was a cruel mistress, forcing her to see the truth. Timothy had no intention of changing. The man she had married no longer existed, replaced by someone who saw her as nothing more than an inconvenience. And if she stayed, she would break beyond repair. As she lay there, staring at the ceiling, she made a decision that had been creeping up on her for weeks. She had to leave. But leaving wasn't as easy as it seemed. She had no job, no income, and with a child on the way, the world outside felt terrifying. Timothy had isolated her from most of her friends, ensuring she had nowhere to turn. And even though she still spoke to her father, Victor Reed, she had kept him in the dark about the abuse, too ashamed to admit what had become of her marriage. If she told him now, what would he say? Would he be disappointed in her? She wasn't sure, but she knew she couldn't continue like this. Her baby deserved better than this life of misery. For the first time in months, she allowed herself to think about a future without Timothy, one where she wasn't afraid, where she could smile again. And once that thought entered her mind, it refused to leave. The next morning, she tried to keep her distance from Timothy, afraid that he would see the change in her and lash out again. She moved carefully, cooking breakfast in silence, keeping her eyes down whenever he entered the room. But inside, she was planning. She would gather whatever little money she had hidden away. She would call her father and tell him everything. And when the time was right, she would leave and never look back. But as she washed the dishes, she felt his presence behind her, cold and menacing. "What are you thinking about?" Timothy's voice was sharp, suspicious. Elena stiffened, shaking her head. "Nothing," she murmured. But she could feel his eyes on her, studying her like a predator watching its prey. He didn't believe her. And for the first time, she didn't care. That night, she sat in bed, staring at the small suitcase she had placed under the bed earlier. She wasn't ready yet, but soon. Soon, she would be free. The thought gave her strength, even as Timothy came home late, reeking of alcohol and another woman's perfume. He ignored her completely, not even sparing her a glance as he climbed into bed and fell asleep. Elena turned away from him, placing a hand over her stomach. "Don't worry, little one," she whispered. "We won't stay here much longer." Benita Collins was more than just Timothy's mistress. She was his addiction, his poison, the voice whispering in his ear, feeding his hatred for Elena. From the moment she entered his life, she had made it her mission to turn him against his wife completely. And she succeeded. While Elena suffered in silence, Benita thrived, growing bolder in her demands. She wanted more money, more gifts, more of Timothy's time, and most importantly, she wanted Elena gone. "She's pathetic," Benita sneered one evening, running her manicured fingers through Timothy's hair. "Still clinging to you like a lost puppy. Why don't you just get rid of her already?" Timothy sighed, rubbing his temple. "It's not that simple, Benita." "Yes, it is," she countered, pouting. "You're not a coward, are you?" Benita knew exactly how to manipulate Timothy. She stroked his ego, feeding his arrogance, making him feel powerful. She convinced him that Elena was nothing but dead weight, that his life would be better without her. And the worst part? He believed her. Every time he looked at Elena, he saw her through Benita's eyes, weak, useless, and embarrassment. He resented her for existing, for carrying a child he no longer wanted. And as Benita's influence over him grew, so did his cruelty. He no longer cared if Elena was hurt, if she cried, if she begged for kindness. In fact, he enjoyed seeing her suffer. One evening, after spending the entire day with Benita, Timothy came home and found Elena sitting in the living room, staring at an old photo of their wedding day. The sight infuriated him. "Why do you still keep that?" he snapped, grabbing the frame and throwing it against the wall, the glass shattering. Elena flinched but said nothing. Timothy scoffed. "Pathetic," he muttered, echoing Benita's words. "You think this means something? It doesn't. It never did." Elena clenched her fists, her resolve hardening. She wouldn't let his words break her, not anymore. As Timothy stormed off, slamming the bedroom door behind him, Elena sat there, staring at the broken glass on the floor. She felt nothing. Not sadness, not fear, not anger. Just emptiness. And in that emptiness, she realized something. Benita had already won. Timothy wasn't hers anymore. He had never truly been hers. And the sooner she accepted that, the sooner she could let go. The only thing left to do now was leave. Elena had always believed that marriage was built on love, respect, and understanding. But with each passing day, her marriage to Timothy proved to be nothing more than a prison sentence. He was no longer just cruel with his words, his violence had escalated. That evening, she had dared to ask him where he had been, hoping for even the smallest trace of remorse. Instead, she was met with a sharp slap across her face, the impact sending her stumbling back. Her cheek burned, but it was his words that left the deepest wound. "You dare question me?" Timothy sneered, his eyes dark with fury. "You and your wretched family should be grateful I even married you." Elena clutched her stomach protectively, her entire body trembling. She had known Timothy had little regard for her, but to hear him insult her family, the people who had raised her with love and care, was unbearable. "My family is not wretched," she whispered, voice shaking. "They are more noble than you could ever understand." Timothy laughed coldly. "Noble? Please. Your father is just some failed businessman, and your mother—" He stopped, grinning as he saw the anger flare in Elena's eyes. "What, you don't like hearing the truth?" He grabbed her wrist tightly. "You're nothing without me, Elena. Just a burden I should have thrown away a long time ago." Tears burned in Elena's eyes, but she refused to let them fall. She had cried too many times for a man who didn't deserve her pain. Instead, she straightened her back, staring at him with a coldness she hadn't known she was capable of. "You think I'm nothing without you?" she asked, voice eerily calm. "You're the one who will end up with nothing." Timothy scoffed, amused by her defiance. "We'll see about that." With a final shove, he stormed out of the room, slamming the door behind him. Elena exhaled shakily, pressing a hand to her stomach. "I won't let him hurt us," she whispered to her unborn child. "I promise." That night, as Timothy drank himself into a stupor, Elena lay awake, her mind racing. She had endured enough. There was no saving this marriage, no hoping for a change that would never come. She had one choice left, to leave before it was too late. But before she could act, fate had already begun shifting in her favor. Unbeknownst to her, someone had been watching. Someone who would soon ensure that Timothy regretted every cruel word, every act of violence. Victor Reed had seen enough. Victor Reed had always been a patient man. A powerful billionaire who built his empire from the ground up, he knew the value of waiting for the right moment. But when it came to his daughter's suffering, his patience had run thin. He had always been aware of Timothy's arrogance, his greed, but he had given his daughter the freedom to make her own choices. Now, seeing the bruises on her face, the pain in her eyes, he regretted his silence. For weeks, Victor had been investigating Timothy. His influence reached farther than Timothy could ever imagine, and what he uncovered only deepened his anger. Timothy wasn't just unfaithful, he was squandering money on Benita, using company funds for personal luxuries, gambling away his future. He was drowning in debt, unaware that his destruction was already set in motion. Victor could have crushed him instantly, but he wanted Timothy to feel every bit of the downfall he deserved. And most importantly, he wanted Elena to be ready when the time came. She had to be the one to walk away. One evening, Victor visited Elena under the pretense of checking on her. She was hesitant, trying to hide the bruises with makeup, but he saw everything. As they sat in the living room, he watched her closely. "Elena," he said softly, "is this the life you want?" She flinched at the question, looking away. "I don't know," she murmured. "I just want my child to have a family." Victor sighed, reaching for her hand. "A family isn't built on pain," he told her. "Your child deserves better. You deserve better." Elena's eyes filled with tears, but she nodded. For the first time, she allowed herself to imagine a future without Timothy. And in that moment, Victor knew she was ready. "When you're ready to leave, I'll be here," he promised. "You are not alone." The final insult came one cold morning when Elena woke up to the sound of laughter echoing from the living room. At first, she thought it was the television, but as she stepped out of her bedroom, she saw something that made her blood run cold. Benita Collins was lounging comfortably on the couch, wearing one of Timothy's shirts, her legs tucked under her as she sipped coffee. The sight was so outrageous that for a moment, Elena thought she was dreaming. But the smirk on Benita's face told her this was all real. "Good morning, Elena," Benita purred, stretching lazily. "I hope you don't mind, but I decided to make myself at home." Elena's fingers curled into fists, but she forced herself to remain calm. Before she could respond, Timothy walked in, a smug look on his face. He wrapped an arm around Benita's shoulders as if they were some happy couple. "Get used to it, Elena," he said casually. "Benita is staying here from now on." Elena's breath hitched. What? She knew Timothy was cruel, but this was beyond anything she had imagined. Bringing his mistress into their home while she was still pregnant with his child, was there no limit to his wickedness? Benita chuckled, resting her head against Timothy's chest. "Oh, don't look so shocked, darling," she taunted. "You should have known this was coming. Timothy doesn't love you. He never did. You were just a boring little housewife keeping his bed warm until I came along." Elena's hands trembled, but not with sadness, with rage. She looked at Timothy, hoping, just for a second, that he might realize how cruel he was being. But all she saw in his eyes was amusement. He was enjoying her pain. "You're disgusting," she finally whispered. Timothy scoffed, rolling his eyes. "Say whatever you want," he said. "But I'm done pretending. Benita makes me happy. You're just a burden. You can either stay here and accept it, or you can leave. But either way, Benita is not going anywhere." Elena took a shaky breath, her heartbeat roaring in her ears. Everything inside her screamed to leave, to run far away from this humiliation. But then she felt a small movement, the soft flutter of life inside her womb. Her child. She couldn't walk away. Not yet. Not like this. Slowly, she straightened her back, lifting her chin. "I'm not going anywhere," she said firmly. Timothy's smirk faltered. "What?" Benita scoffed, looking irritated. "Oh, please. You really want to stay here and watch us be together?" Elena's lips curled into a cold smile. "Yes. And let's see how long you last, Benita." She turned on her heel, walking away with quiet dignity. Timothy and Benita might have thought they had won, but they had no idea who they were dealing with. She was Victor Reed's daughter. And she wasn't going down without a fight. Elena had endured many humiliations in her marriage, but the day Timothy moved Benita into their home was the moment something inside her snapped. For months, she had held on to hope that he would come to his senses, that he would at least show some concern for their unborn child. But as she watched Benita walk around her house like she owned it, dressed in Timothy's clothes, she knew there was nothing left to save. Timothy had already chosen his side. She was merely a bystander in the ruins of her own marriage. And she was done being silent. That evening, Elena sat at the dining table across from Timothy and Benita, who whispered and laughed as if she wasn't there. She stared at them with a calmness that made Timothy shift uncomfortably. "I want a divorce," she said, her voice firm. The room fell silent. Timothy put down his fork, amusement flickering in his eyes. "A divorce," he repeated mockingly. "And go where, Elena? You have nothing without me." Benita chuckled beside him, sipping her wine. "Yes, dear, where will you go? Your family is barely middle class, right?" Elena clenched her fists under the table. They still thought she was a poor nobody. Timothy had never bothered to investigate her background, and she had never corrected his assumptions. Now, his arrogance would be his downfall. She leaned back in her chair, crossing her arms. "You're right, Timothy. I don't have anywhere to go," she said, her voice deceptively soft. "So I'll stay here. For now." Timothy smirked, thinking he had won. What he didn't know was that Elena wasn't staying because she was weak, she was staying to watch him destroy himself. That night, as Timothy and Benita celebrated in their bedroom, Elena sat in her room, cradling her stomach. "I won't let him take everything from me," she whispered to her unborn child. "He thinks he's untouchable, but he has no idea who he married." She knew her father, Victor Reed, had been watching from the shadows, waiting for her to reach out. But Elena wasn't ready to ask for help just yet. She wanted to see just how far Timothy would go in his cruelty before she finally shattered his world. Timothy had never been excited about Elena's pregnancy. He had always treated it as a burden rather than a blessing. But now that Benita was in the house, his disdain for the child grew stronger. Whenever Elena mentioned doctor's appointments or the baby kicking, he would roll his eyes or walk away, uninterested. "That baby isn't even mine," he muttered one day when Benita was around. Elena froze. She had expected him to be indifferent, but outright denial? That was a new low, even for him. Benita smirked, resting her hand on Timothy's chest. "Oh, darling, I've been telling you for months," she purred. "Elena probably got pregnant by some lowlife before trapping you in this marriage." Timothy chuckled, looking at Elena with disgust. "Exactly. That's why I don't give a damn about that child." The words sent a sharp pain through Elena's heart, but she refused to give them the satisfaction of seeing her break. Instead, she smiled. "That's an interesting theory, Timothy," she said coolly. "But if you truly believe that, why don't we get a paternity test once the baby is born?" Timothy scoffed. "Why would I waste my time? I already know the truth." Benita laughed beside him, clearly enjoying the show. "You're better off without that brat anyway," she whispered. Elena made no response, but deep inside, she was seething. He would regret those words soon enough. Later that night, as Elena lay in bed, she felt another flutter from her baby. She placed a gentle hand on her stomach, her resolve hardening. "He doesn't want you, but that's okay," she whispered. "Because you have me. And I promise, little one, you'll never suffer the way I did." Timothy's cruelty had reached its peak, and Elena knew she couldn't allow her child to grow up in this toxic environment. It was time to start planning her escape. As days passed, even Timothy's friends and colleagues began to notice how heartless he had become. At company gatherings, he made no effort to hide his disdain for Elena, often leaving her to sit alone while he flaunted Benita on his arm. At first, his co-workers ignored it, thinking it was just another rich man's affair. But soon, whispers began to spread. "Isn't he still married?" some would murmur. "That poor woman. She looks exhausted." Timothy didn't care. He basked in the attention he received from his mistress, convinced that Elena was powerless. When one of his colleagues, Mark, approached him at a corporate event, Timothy waved him off. "Man, don't you think you're going too far?" Mark asked. "Elena's pregnant. She doesn't deserve this." Timothy scoffed. "She's lucky I haven't kicked her out yet," he said. "Once I get my promotion, I'll finally be rid of her." Unbeknownst to him, Elena overheard the conversation. A bitter smile played on her lips. So that was his plan? To wait until he got his promotion and then throw her away like trash? He really was a fool. Did he not know who her father was? Did he not realize that by humiliating her, he was digging his own grave? She wasn't going anywhere until she saw him fall. That night, she made her first move. She reached out to her father. It was time for Victor Reed to step in. Not to save her, but to watch as she destroyed Timothy's world piece by piece. Benita had always been cunning, but now that she had fully secured Timothy's loyalty, she wanted to see Elena completely broken. "Darling," she cooed one night as they lay in bed. "Don't you think it's time to finish this once and for all?" Timothy raised an eyebrow. "What do you mean?" Benita smirked. "Humiliate her. Publicly. Make sure she knows she was never worthy of you." Timothy laughed, intrigued. "Go on." Benita ran her fingers along his chest, her voice dripping with malice. "The company's end-of-year gala is coming up, right? Everyone important will be there. Invite Elena. Make her believe you want to make things right." Timothy grinned. "And then what?" Benita giggled. "And then you humiliate her in front of everyone. Make it clear that she was never good enough for you." Timothy's eyes gleamed with excitement. "I like the way you think." The plan was set. They would invite Elena to the gala under the pretense of reconciliation, only to publicly disgrace her in front of the entire company. Timothy believed this would finally push Elena to leave. What he didn't know was that this event would be the beginning of his downfall. Elena accepted the invitation without hesitation, keeping her expression neutral. She already knew what they were planning. But she didn't care. Let them have their fun. Soon, the tables would turn. Timothy sat in his luxurious office, twirling a pen between his fingers as he smirked at the plan forming in his mind. The upcoming end-of-year gala was the perfect opportunity to humiliate Elena in front of the entire business elite. He had already secured a prime spot for Benita at the event, ensuring she would be seated beside him as his official partner. In his mind, Elena had overstayed her welcome in his life, and this would be the final blow that shattered any illusion she had left about their marriage. As he envisioned the spectacle, he relished the thought of the crowd laughing at her expense. He would make sure she knew she was nothing but a disgrace, an unwanted burden in his life. The plan was simple: public humiliation, ensuring that no one in high society would ever respect her again. Benita, seated across from him in a tight red dress, leaned forward with an amused glint in her eyes. "I still don't understand why you don't just throw her out already," she purred, sipping on her wine. "Why waste time with this event?" Timothy chuckled, shaking his head. "Because, my darling," he replied, "this isn't just about ending things. It's about ending them with style. I want her to feel the sting of rejection in front of everyone." He had already arranged for Elena to receive an official invitation, making it seem as though he was extending an olive branch. She would come, believing there was a chance for reconciliation, only to be met with cold, merciless humiliation. Benita clapped her hands together, delighting in the cruelty. "I love it," she said, leaning in to kiss him. Meanwhile, Elena sat in her room, clutching the invitation with trembling hands. It was the first time in months that Timothy had formally acknowledged her presence, and a tiny flicker of hope ignited in her chest. Could this be his way of making amends? Had he finally come to his senses and realized the damage he had done? Deep down, she knew better than to expect kindness from him, but desperation clung to her like a second skin. She was tired of fighting, tired of hoping, but the baby inside her gave her the strength to believe that maybe, just maybe, Timothy was ready to change. If not for her, then at least for their child. Unbeknownst to her, Victor Reed was already aware of the scheme. He had been watching Timothy's every move, and when he learned of his son-in-law's plan, his blood boiled. His daughter had suffered in silence for too long, and this was the final straw. Victor had kept his distance, wanting Elena to make her own decisions, but he would not allow this injustice to continue. The gala would not be the end of Elena's suffering, it would be the beginning of Timothy's downfall. Victor silently vowed to turn the tables in a way that Timothy could never see coming. As the days leading up to the gala passed, Elena found herself torn between anticipation and dread. She stared at the reflection in her mirror, running a hand over her slightly swollen belly. This was her chance. Perhaps Timothy had finally realized his mistakes. Maybe he had been too influenced by Benita and now wanted to make things right. The invitation had been delivered formally, with an embossed seal, the kind he used for business associates. It had to mean something, didn't it? Clutching onto that hope, she decided she would go. If not for herself, then for the sake of their unborn child. She picked out a simple yet elegant black gown, her way of showing up with dignity despite everything Timothy had done. Her heart pounded as she imagined the possibilities. Would he apologize? Would he ask her to move back into their bedroom? Would he place a hand on her belly and acknowledge the life growing inside her? She knew it was foolish to dream, but after all the suffering, wasn't she owed even a small miracle? Her father had warned her against expecting too much, but she refused to believe there was no humanity left in Timothy. She had loved him once, and some part of her still held on to that love. Meanwhile, Timothy prepared for the event with a cruel smile. He had arranged for a dramatic entrance with Benita, ensuring all eyes would be on them when they arrived. He had even instructed the waitstaff to pour a drink over Elena's dress at the right moment. It was all orchestrated perfectly. She would come expecting reconciliation, only to be crushed under the weight of his ridicule. He had already told colleagues about his big reveal, making sure they were in on the joke. His mind was too clouded with his own arrogance to realize that his actions would soon backfire in ways he never imagined. Victor, however, remained 2 steps ahead. He had no intention of letting his daughter be humiliated. That night, he made a call to one of his most trusted allies, a man with deep connections in the business world. It's time, he said simply, his voice void of emotion. Make sure the board is ready. While Timothy celebrated his upcoming scheme, Victor was laying the foundation for something far greater, a downfall that Timothy would never recover from. The stage was set, but it wasn't Elena who would be blindsided. Timothy and Benita lounged in his penthouse suite, sipping expensive wine and basking in their wicked anticipation. The gala was just hours away, and everything was set in motion for Elena's public disgrace. Timothy leaned back on the couch, draping an arm around Benita's shoulders as she traced circles on his chest. Just imagine her face when she realizes it was all a lie, he chuckled. She'll be humiliated in front of everyone important in the business world. After this, she won't be able to hold her head up anywhere. His voice was thick with arrogance, his confidence unwavering. Benita smirked and toyed with the diamond necklace he had gifted her earlier that evening. And the best part, she purred. Everyone will see that you've moved on to someone better. No more sympathy for that pitiful wife of yours. After tomorrow, she'll be nothing but a joke. She took a sip of her wine and tilted her head. But tell me, darling, what happens after the gala? Are you finally getting rid of her for good? Timothy exhaled sharply, considering her words. Once she's destroyed socially, she'll have no choice but to leave on her own. No alimony, no sympathy, no nothing. She'll be a nobody. Meanwhile, Elena sat in her bedroom, staring at the invitation with conflicted emotions. She wanted to believe in a miracle, but the sinking feeling in her gut wouldn't leave her. She had spent years suffering under Timothy's neglect, yet a part of her still longed for a resolution. What if this was her chance to reclaim the love she had lost? What if he had finally seen the error of his ways? Maybe this is a fresh start, she whispered, placing a hand on her belly. Maybe he wants to be a father. But even as she said the words, doubt gnawed at her heart. While Elena battled her emotions, Victor Reed was already orchestrating his masterstroke. His men had gathered all the information he needed, and the time for patience had passed. He knew his daughter was walking into a trap, but he would let Timothy believe his plan was working. A cruel smile played on his lips as he picked up his phone and made one final call. Make sure everything is in place for tomorrow, he instructed. And when the time comes, I want him to fall so hard that he never recovers. The night before the gala was silent, but the storm was coming. The gala was in full swing, glittering chandeliers casting golden light over the grand ballroom. Guests dressed in their finest attire mingled, sipping champagne and exchanging pleasantries. Timothy arrived fashionably late, hand in hand with Benita, ensuring that all eyes were on them. Whispers spread through the crowd as they made their entrance, their blatant display of affection sending a clear message: Timothy Richards had moved on. He smirked, reveling in the attention, as he scanned the room for Elena. Elena arrived shortly after, her simple yet elegant black gown doing little to hide the nervousness in her eyes. She stepped inside, clutching her small purse tightly, hoping against hope that Timothy had invited her for a reconciliation. The moment her gaze landed on him, laughing, holding Benita close, her heart plummeted. The realization hit her like a punch to the gut. This wasn't a night of redemption. This was a spectacle, and she was the fool. Murmurs rippled through the crowd as people turned to watch, waiting for the drama to unfold. Timothy took a sip of his drink and smirked before walking over to her. Elena, he drawled, his voice dripping with condescension. I see you actually showed up. How unfortunate. His voice carried through the room, drawing more attention to them. Did you really think this was some romantic gesture? That I wanted you back? He let out a cruel laugh, shaking his head. God, you're pathetic. Benita, standing beside him, giggled before stepping closer. Darling, should I tell her, or should you? She asked, eyes twinkling with mischief. Timothy didn't wait. Ladies and gentlemen, he called out, raising his glass. Let's give a round of applause to the most clueless woman in the room, my soon-to-be ex-wife. Laughter erupted from the guests as a waiter, on cue, accidentally spilled a glass of wine onto Elena's dress. Gasps and chuckles followed, and in that moment, something inside Elena shattered. She had endured years of mistreatment, had hoped for change, but this was it. This was her breaking point. Without a word, she turned and walked away, her head held high. But the humiliation wouldn't be hers for long. Elena walked out of the ballroom, her vision blurred with unshed tears. Every step felt heavy, as if the weight of years of pain was finally pressing down on her. But instead of feeling broken, she felt something else, something powerful. This was not defeat. This was clarity. She was done with Timothy Richards. The moment she stepped outside, a black limousine pulled up, and the door opened. Inside sat her father, Victor Reed, his expression unreadable. Without hesitation, she slid into the car, leaving behind the world that had laughed at her suffering. Victor said nothing as the car pulled away from the venue. He simply reached over and placed a comforting hand over hers. "Are you ready?" he finally asked. Elena turned to face him, her eyes burning with a newfound determination. "Yes," she said, voice steady. "I'm done crying. I want him to pay." Victor smiled, pride gleaming in his eyes. "Good. Because tomorrow, his world ends." That night, for the first time in years, Elena slept peacefully. Meanwhile, Timothy basked in his victory, completely unaware that his downfall had already begun. His colleagues cheered for him, patting him on the back for the brilliant show he had put on. Benita clung to his arm, whispering sweet nothings into his ear. He was on top of the world, confident that he had finally rid himself of Elena for good. If only he knew that his reign of cruelty was about to come crashing down in the most spectacular way. The next morning, Timothy woke up feeling invincible. The gala had been a success, Elena was out of his life, and now, all that remained was his upcoming promotion. He strutted into the office, already imagining himself as the new CEO. His colleagues greeted him with wide grins, fueling his confidence even further. "Big day, huh?" one of them said, patting his back. "The boss is really impressed with you." Timothy smirked. Of course, he was. He had worked tirelessly for this moment. As the day wore on, Timothy's excitement grew. He spent hours on the phone with Benita, gushing about how perfect everything had turned out. "By tonight, I'll be CEO," he boasted. "And then we can finally enjoy the good life without any baggage." Benita giggled, already picturing herself as the wife of a powerful executive. She had played her role well, and now, it was time to reap the benefits. What neither of them knew was that Victor Reed had already secured a different future for Timothy, one that involved complete and utter ruin. And as the evening approached, the stage was set for the most humiliating revelation of Timothy's life. He had no idea that his world was about to come crashing down. Elena sat in her father's luxurious study, her hands trembling as she finally decided to confide in him. Victor Reed, a man feared and respected in the corporate world, listened intently as his daughter detailed the years of suffering she endured at Timothy's hands. His face remained impassive, but his grip on the armrest of his chair tightened. He had watched from the shadows, hoping Elena would leave the marriage on her own, but now, hearing the depth of her pain firsthand, he realized he had waited too long. She was not just a broken woman, she was a mother fighting for the dignity of her unborn child. Victor leaned forward, his deep voice filled with authority. "It's time, Elena. You've given that man enough chances. He has made his choices, now, let's make ours." Elena hesitated, unsure of what her father meant. Despite all that had happened, she had never truly considered revenge. She had thought only of escape, of finding peace away from the torment. But now, she saw the fire in her father's eyes, a fire that told her Timothy would finally reap the consequences of his cruelty. Victor picked up his phone and made a single call. "Move forward with the plan," he said simply, and Elena's stomach tightened. She had always known her father was powerful, but she never truly grasped the extent of his reach. He had never interfered before, but now, he was taking full control. She could only imagine what that meant for Timothy. The next morning, Elena received a package from one of her father's assistants. Inside was a legal document that made her the primary heir to Victor Reed's business empire. Her father had decided that instead of simply punishing Timothy, he would elevate her to a position of power beyond anything Timothy could ever dream of. She was now the official CEO-in-waiting of Reed Enterprises, a position that would soon be announced publicly. But that was just the beginning. The second document in the package was a legal separation agreement, drafted and ready for her signature. If she signed it, Timothy would be stripped of every asset linked to her name, his house, his car, even his job. It was the first time Elena truly understood what her father meant when he said, "Let's make our choice." This wasn't just about leaving Timothy. This was about taking everything back. That night, as Elena sat in her room staring at the documents, she felt a shift within herself. She had spent so long trying to hold on to a marriage that was never meant to be. She had endured abuse, humiliation, and betrayal, believing that somehow, if she loved hard enough, Timothy would change. But now, she saw the truth. Timothy had made his choice the moment he brought Benita into their home. He had chosen power, greed, and cruelty over love, and now, he would face the consequences. With steady hands, Elena picked up a pen and signed the separation papers. It was time for Timothy Richards' downfall to begin. Victor Reed was a man who built an empire through calculated decisions, ruthless precision, and an unwavering commitment to protecting his own. Timothy had made a grave mistake in underestimating the family he married into, and now, he would pay the price. Victor didn't just want revenge, he wanted to strip Timothy of everything, just as he had stripped Elena of her dignity. In the weeks following Elena's confession, Victor set his plan in motion. He called in favors from powerful allies, influential businessmen, and senior executives within Timothy's company. Timothy had spent months boasting about his upcoming promotion, unaware that Victor had already spoken to the company's board members. The promotion Timothy was counting on? It would be given to Elena instead. The house he had thrown Elena out of? Legally, it was tied to her father's vast estate, and soon, Timothy would be evicted. Every bank account, every financial privilege he had enjoyed under the illusion of power, Victor ensured it would all be revoked in a single day. But Victor was not content with just financial ruin, he wanted Timothy to feel true humiliation. He arranged for Elena's return to the corporate world, not as a discarded wife, but as a woman reborn. A press conference was scheduled for Thanksgiving Day, the same day Timothy expected to be promoted. But instead of receiving recognition, Timothy would be publicly exposed. Victor gathered damning evidence, proof of Timothy's financial mismanagement, his reckless spending on Benita, and even videos of him ridiculing Elena. Every detail would be revealed before the very people he had tried to impress. As an added touch, Victor made sure Timothy's so-called friends, those who had encouraged his arrogance, would be present. They would bear witness to his downfall, ensuring there was no one left to lend him a hand when it all came crashing down. Meanwhile, Elena was undergoing a transformation of her own. She was no longer the woman who had begged for Timothy's love or endured his cruelty in silence. Under her father's guidance, she reclaimed her confidence, her power, and most importantly, her self-worth. She attended high-profile meetings, familiarized herself with the business world, and prepared for the role that awaited her. It was a slow but steady rebirth. With each passing day, the scars of her past no longer defined her, they became reminders of the strength she had gained. She no longer cared for Timothy's approval or his regret, what she wanted now was justice, and she was ready to claim it. The night before Thanksgiving, Victor hosted a private gathering with select investors and board members. Timothy was not invited, but he heard whispers of it and assumed it was a celebration in anticipation of his promotion. He gloated to Benita, unaware that the very people he trusted were preparing to cast him aside. As Victor raised a toast that evening, his words were simple yet chilling. "Tomorrow, justice will be served. My daughter will rise, and a man unworthy of her name will fall." The room filled with nods of agreement, and as the guests drank to the impending downfall, Timothy remained blissfully ignorant. The stage was set, and in mere hours, his world would collapse. Timothy was on top of the world, convinced that his promotion to senior director was inevitable. He walked through the office halls with an air of arrogance, nodding smugly at his colleagues as if he were already their superior. Over the past few weeks, he had heard whispers about upcoming leadership changes, and every indication pointed toward his success. He had worked tirelessly, or so he believed, to secure this position, charming executives at company gatherings and pretending to be a visionary leader. His confidence was so high that he didn't even consider the possibility of failure. To him, Thanksgiving would be the day he solidified his power, proving once and for all that leaving Elena was the right decision. He had bragged to Benita for weeks, painting a picture of their luxurious future, where she would be the wife of a powerful corporate executive. Benita, always hungry for wealth, fawned over him, already making plans for lavish shopping sprees and extravagant vacations. That evening, Timothy and Benita shared an expensive dinner, toasting to their impending success. "This is just the beginning," Timothy declared, sipping his whiskey with a self-satisfied smirk. "Once I'm promoted, I'll have control over major projects, and my salary will triple." "You'll never have to work another day in your life, Benita." She giggled, running a manicured hand down his arm. "That's exactly what I deserve, baby. I told you that wretched Elena was holding you back. With her gone, the universe is finally giving you what you deserve." Timothy chuckled, completely unaware of the storm brewing behind the scenes. Victor Reed had made his move, and Timothy's fate had already been sealed. As he celebrated his so-called victory, the very people he believed supported him were sharpening the knives for his public execution. Meanwhile, Elena was preparing for her grand return, not as the weak woman Timothy had abandoned, but as the powerful heiress of Victor Reed's empire. In the past few weeks, she had undergone an intense transformation, stepping into her role as a formidable businesswoman. Under her father's guidance, she had learned everything about the company's operations, financial dealings, and upcoming projects. She knew that taking over Timothy's expected position would send shockwaves through the organization, but she didn't care. This wasn't about revenge, it was about reclaiming her place. She had been humiliated, discarded, and mocked, but now, she would make a statement so powerful that no one would ever dare underestimate her again. On the morning of Thanksgiving, she stood before the mirror, dressed in an elegant yet commanding suit, her expression one of quiet determination. As the Thanksgiving corporate event drew closer, excitement buzzed through the office. Employees speculated about who would receive the coveted promotion, and Timothy basked in their attention. He strutted into the venue, greeting executives with an overconfident grin. He had no idea that Elena had already arrived, waiting behind the scenes for the perfect moment to step into the spotlight. Victor had ensured that the event would be packed with reporters, ensuring that every moment of Timothy's downfall would be documented. The stage was set, the audience was in place, and as Timothy eagerly awaited his name to be called, he had no idea that the biggest shock of his life was only minutes away. Elena stood before the mirror, her reflection unrecognizable from the woman she had been just months ago. Gone was the timid, broken wife who had suffered under Timothy's cruelty. In her place stood a powerful, self-assured woman, one who no longer sought validation from anyone, least of all a man who had never valued her. Her tailored navy blue suit fit perfectly, exuding confidence and authority. The diamond earrings her father had gifted her shimmered under the bright lights, a reminder of the wealth and power she had been born into but had once ignored in the name of love. Now, she understood that power was not just about wealth, it was about standing up for oneself, reclaiming what had been stolen, and showing the world that she was no longer a victim. Victor watched her from the doorway, his eyes filled with pride. "You are ready," he said simply. Elena turned to him, a confident smile playing on her lips. "More than ready, father." She had spent weeks preparing for this moment, studying company reports, financial statements, and leadership strategies. She had worked closely with top executives, ensuring that when the announcement was made, no one would question her capabilities. The men who had once dismissed her as Timothy's weak wife would soon bow before her authority. More importantly, Timothy himself would be forced to witness her rise, the same man who had once mocked her, humiliated her, and discarded her as though she was nothing. As she walked toward the venue, her heels clicking against the marble floor, she felt a newfound sense of power surge through her veins. Every step was a statement, one that declared she was no longer the woman Timothy had once trampled on. She had risen, and today, the world would see it. The Thanksgiving corporate event was filled with employees, investors, and reporters, all eagerly anticipating the big announcement. Elena moved through the crowd with grace, her presence commanding attention. Many recognized her, whispering among themselves in shock. Was this really the same Elena who had been humiliated at the last gala? She was unrecognizable, an enigma wrapped in elegance and authority. Meanwhile, Timothy remained oblivious to the storm that was about to hit. He stood in the center of the room, basking in the admiration of his colleagues. "Any minute now," he told Benita smugly. "They'll call my name, and I'll walk up there as the new senior director." Benita clung to his arm, her eyes gleaming with greed. "I can't wait, baby. We're about to be unstoppable." They were both so consumed with their illusions of grandeur that they didn't notice the subtle shift in the room, the murmurs growing louder, the cameras turning toward the entrance. Then, in a voice that carried across the hall, the CEO stepped onto the stage and announced, "Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome our new senior director, Elena." A stunned silence filled the grand hall. Timothy's smug expression froze as the CEO's words echoed in his ears. His name had not been called. Instead, the woman he had humiliated, discarded, and mocked stood tall, commanding the stage. Elena Richards. The very name sent a shiver down his spine. He turned to Benita, but she was just as shocked, her grip on his arm tightening. The moment felt surreal. This had to be a mistake. He had worked tirelessly, or at least that's what he believed, to secure this promotion. How could Elena, of all people, have taken it? Elena walked up the stage with an air of confidence that left everyone in awe. She wasn't the broken woman Timothy had once known. She was powerful now, and every step she took was a declaration of her triumph. Dressed in an elegant but commanding suit, she stood before the audience, taking in the moment. The board members clapped enthusiastically, clearly in support of the decision. The CEO continued, "Elena has shown remarkable leadership, resilience, and vision. She has worked behind the scenes to bring major investments into this company, and we are honored to have her lead us forward." The crowd erupted in applause, but Timothy remained frozen, his mind spinning in disbelief. Elena took the microphone, her voice poised and firm. "Thank you, Mr. CEO. It is truly an honor to step into this role. Some may wonder how I arrived here, but let me make one thing clear: I am not here because of luck. I am here because I refuse to let anyone dictate my worth. To those who doubted me, mocked me, and treated me as insignificant, I hope this serves as a reminder that power is not determined by who you marry, but by who you choose to become." She turned her gaze toward Timothy, locking eyes with him for the first time in months. He saw no trace of the timid wife he once controlled. Instead, he saw a woman who had risen above him. Timothy's face turned red with humiliation as whispers filled the hall. His colleagues looked at him differently now, not with admiration, but with disdain. The weight of his downfall pressed down on him, making it hard to breathe. Benita tugged at his sleeve. "Say something. Do something," she hissed, but for the first time in his life, Timothy was speechless. He had underestimated Elena, and now, he was paying the price. As the applause died down, Elena turned back to the audience, her expression unreadable. "But before I fully step into this role, there are some matters that must be addressed." The room grew silent, the anticipation thick in the air. Timothy stiffened. Something about the way she spoke made his stomach twist. Elena gestured toward the large screen behind her. "Many of you have trusted a man who, in reality, was nothing more than a fraud. Let's take a moment to see what has truly been happening behind closed doors." With a nod, the screen lit up, playing a compilation of evidence: Timothy's unauthorized use of company funds to lavish Benita with expensive gifts, footage of him verbally abusing junior employees, and recordings of him badmouthing his superiors, believing he was untouchable. Gasps filled the hall as Timothy's disgrace unfolded before their eyes. His heart pounded against his chest as he turned to the CEO, who now watched him with narrowed eyes. "This is nonsense." "A setup," he barked, but his voice cracked with desperation. Elena tilted her head, her expression calm but sharp. "A setup? So, the financial records showing the thousands you stole, those are fake? The recordings of you disrespecting your superiors, are those fabricated? Or perhaps the way you paraded your mistress through company events, believing yourself invincible, was that also an illusion?" Her voice cut through the room like a blade. Timothy had no defense. There was no way out. The CEO stood from his seat, his expression cold. "Timothy Richards, you are hereby terminated from this company, effective immediately." His words struck Timothy like a death sentence. The once confident man now trembled as security approached. "Wait. No. This isn't fair," he shouted, but no one cared. The respect he once commanded had turned into disgust. As he was escorted out, he turned back to Elena, desperation in his eyes. "You can't do this. Please, Elena, don't do this to me." But Elena simply watched, her expression unreadable. There was no need for revenge, justice had already played its hand. Timothy had lost not just his job, but his reputation, his future, and the very foundation he had built his arrogance upon. When they reached the exit, Benita suddenly yanked her hand away from Timothy's grasp. "Benita," he asked, his voice laced with panic. She looked at him with pure contempt. "I'm not going down with you," she spat before turning on her heels and walking away. Timothy reached for her, but she didn't look back. He was completely and utterly alone. As the doors shut behind him, he finally realized the weight of his actions. He had sacrificed a loyal, loving wife for a mistress who had abandoned him at the first sign of trouble. His arrogance had blinded him, and now he had lost everything. Benita wasted no time erasing Timothy from her life. She returned to her apartment, packed her things, and disappeared without a trace. She had only been with him for the money, and now that he had none, he was useless to her. Timothy called her repeatedly, but she ignored every call, blocking his number without hesitation. Without Benita, Timothy spiraled into despair. He had no savings, no home, and no one to turn to. His so-called friends vanished the moment his downfall became public. No company would hire him with the scandal attached to his name. Everywhere he went, people whispered about his disgrace. He had become the very thing he once mocked, a failure. Homeless and jobless, he wandered the streets, reflecting on his mistakes. His pride had cost him everything, and now all he had left was regret. Days turned into weeks, and Timothy's situation worsened. With no money and no place to stay, he was forced to beg for food. The man who once bathed in luxury now slept on park benches, his clothes tattered and his spirit broken. He thought of Elena every day, haunted by what he had lost. He had mocked her for her supposed wretched family, only to discover she was the daughter of a billionaire. Now, she was thriving while he was nothing. One night, as he sat in an alley, shivering from the cold, he saw a news broadcast through a store window. There was Elena, radiating confidence, speaking about her company's latest success. She had moved on. She had won. And he had lost. For the first time in his life, Timothy truly understood what regret felt like. He had thrown away a woman who had once loved him unconditionally. He had traded her kindness for a shallow affair. And now, he had nothing. He wished he could turn back time, but it was too late. Elena would never look back, never pity him, and never forgive him. He was nothing more than a cautionary tale, a man who had everything but lost it all because of his own arrogance. And as he lay on the cold streets, he realized the cruelest truth of all. He had done this to himself. That's the end of the story. What did you learn about the story? Please leave a like and subscribe to our channel for more interesting stories. Thanks for watching.